I will not marry you. You are not what I expected." Willa read the note aloud, and somewhere behind her, a woman laughed. She stood alone on the depot platform where a husband should have been waiting a mail-order bride from Boston, holding a marriage contract a man had just torn up without the courage to face her. The whole town gathered to watch her shame like a show. Then a stranger's boots hit the boards, and a low voice said the one thing that would change everything. "I can take your trunk if you're willing to come with me. If you love stories where a discarded woman rises and proves her worth, subscribe. Stay to the end and comment the city you're watching from." "You can read it again, ma'am. It won't say anything different the third time." Willa Dawson didn't look up at the station master. She looked at the letter, at the handwriting she'd studied for 4 months across 1,000 miles of correspondence, at the careful, educated slant of a man who had written her, "I believe we will suit each other very well, and I count the days until the train brings you to me." The same hand had written the words she was holding now. "I will not marry you. You are not what I expected." "There's a mistake," she said. "No mistake, ma'am. There is. Mr. Walton and I have an agreement, a signed agreement. I have my copy in this trunk. He sent for me. He paid the fare. I know what he did." The station master, a soft-bellied man named Ferris with a mustache stained yellow at the corners, would not meet her eyes. He kept looking at the rails at the water tower, at anything that was not the woman standing in front of him, with a letter shaking in her gloved hand. "He come by this morning, left that with me. Said to give it to the lady off the Boston train and no other. He was here." Her voice cracked in the middle of the word. "He was standing right where you're standing, and he didn't have the decency to. He didn't want a scene." Willa laughed. It came out wrong, high and thin, nothing like a laugh at all. He didn't want a scene. Behind her, someone tittered. She turned. There were maybe 15 of them gathered along the edge of the platform and down onto the street. She hadn't noticed them arriving. She'd been too busy holding herself upright, too busy telling herself that any moment James Walton would come striding down the boards with an apology on his lips and an explanation for why he wasn't waiting when the train pulled in. Now she saw them, a cluster of women in Sunday bonnets, even though it was Thursday. 2 old men with a checkerboard between them, the game abandoned. A boy on a rain barrel. A woman in a green dress with a face like a locked door. They had come to watch. "That's her," one of the bonneted women said, not even bothering to lower her voice. "That's the one he sent all the way to Boston for. Thought she'd be prettier. Thought she'd be younger. Elizabeth Hartley, hush your mouth, she can hear you." "I don't much care if she can." Willa's spine went straight as a fence rail. She folded the letter once slowly along its original crease and slid it into the pocket of her traveling coat as though it were something valuable instead of a knife somebody had left in her chest. She would not cry. She had decided that somewhere around the third telling standing here, and she held to it now the way a drowning woman holds to a plank. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "when is the next train east?" "Tuesday." "Tuesday. 5 days. And the fare to Boston." Ferris finally looked at her, and there was something almost like pity in it, which was worse than the laughing. "Ma'am, the fare to Boston is more money than most folks in this town see in half a year." "I have—" She stopped. She had $4.60. She had counted it 3 times on the train, because counting it was something to do with her hands. $4.60 a trunk of clothes and books, and a marriage contract that a man had signed and then torn up in front of a whole town without even having the courage to do it to her face. "I see," she said. She did not see. She saw nothing. She saw a wall. "How much for a room?" she asked the man behind the counter at the Copper Creek Hotel, 20 minutes later, having dragged her trunk half a block by herself because no one offered to help, and she'd be damned before she'd ask. "$1 a night, 2 bits for the wash water. And a week." The man, balding, spectacled, a ledger open in front of him, looked her over, the way you look over a horse you're deciding not to buy. "You're the Walton woman." It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it. "We're full up," he said. The lobby was empty. A cat slept in a patch of sun on the stairs. Somewhere in the back, a clock ticked, and Willa could hear quite clearly that there was no one at all in this hotel except the two of them and the cat. "You're full up," she repeated. "That's right. There's no one here. Reservations." He closed the ledger. Coming in on the Tuesday train, she understood then fully what she was up against. It wasn't that James Walton had rejected her. A man could reject a woman. That was an old story, and she'd have survived it. It was that he had rejected her loudly in front of everyone, and now the whole town had decided which side of it they were on before she'd said a single word in her own defense. She was the outsider. He was theirs. And a town closes around its own the way a fist closes around a stone. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her to say thank you even to men who wouldn't give her a bed. She turned to drag her trunk back out into the street with nowhere on God's earth to drag it to. "Ma'am?" She stopped. "There's a boarding house," the man said, not unkindly now that she was leaving. "Widow Pruitt. End of Front Street, blue door. She takes women, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" "She'll want to know how you mean to pay, and she'll have heard by now, same as everybody." Same as everybody. The whole town in an afternoon. "Of course she will," Willa said, and pushed the door open with her shoulder. Whoosh. The blue door opened before she'd finished knocking, which told her the widow had watched her come up the whole length of Front Street dragging that trunk. Mrs. Pruitt was a small woman, narrow through the shoulders, with hands that had clearly done 40 years of hard work, and eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Willa. She looked at the trunk. She looked back at Willa. "You'll be the Boston girl. I'll be leaving Tuesday," Willa said. "I need somewhere until then. I can pay for 4 nights and I can work off the rest. I can cook. I can sew. I can keep books. I can read and write in 3 languages. 3 languages. Mrs. Pruitt's mouth twitched. What good's 3 languages in Copper Creek? None, apparently. The old woman's eyes sharpened at that, a flicker of interest. "You've got a tongue on you." "I've been told it's a fault." "By men, I expect." "By everyone." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her a long moment more. And Willa saw the decision arrive in her face, and she saw it go the wrong way, and she understood before the words even came. "I can't," the widow said, and there was real regret in it, which somehow made it hurt more. "I got 4 boarders. Every one of 'em does business with Walton at the feed store, or owes him, or hopes to marry a daughter off to his nephew. You take a room here, I lose 4 boarders by Sunday, and my house by Christmas. You understand me? It ain't that I think you did anything, it's that it don't matter what I think." "I understand," Willa said. And the terrible thing was, she did. "There's the church," Mrs. Pruitt offered. "Reverend might let you sleep in the—" "Thank you," Willa said, "for being honest with me. You're the first person in this town who has been." And she picked up the handle of her trunk and started back down Front Street, and she did not let the widow see her face. She got as far as the water trough outside the Mercantile before her arms gave out. The trunk hit the dirt. She sat down on it. There was nothing else to sit on, and she put her hands over her face, and for 1 minute, 1 single minute, she let herself feel exactly how alone she was. 23 years old, Boston-born, educated at the Meriwether Academy for Young Ladies, where she'd learned French and Latin and needlepoint, and how to pour tea, and how to make a room believe she was calm when she was breaking apart inside. Orphaned at 19 when the fever took her mother and father in the same week. Left with a name, a trunk of books, and no money at all, because it turned out her father had died owing more than he owned, and everything went to the men he'd owed it to. She'd taken a position as a governess, then another. Then answered an advertisement in a matrimonial paper, because a governess in Boston is 1 bad reference away from the poorhouse. And here was a man, a landowner. He'd written a man of property in the Arizona Territory who wanted a wife of good education and sound character, and did not care that she came without $1. "I do not require a fortune," James Walton had written. "I require a partner." She'd believed him. God help her. She'd wanted so badly to believe him that she'd read those letters until the folds went soft. And she'd let herself imagine a house, a life, a person who would be glad she existed. She'd packed her mother's Bible and her father's watch, and the one good dress she owned, and she'd crossed a continent on the strength of a stranger's handwriting. "You are not what I expected." "Ma'am, you can't sit there." She lowered her hands. A boy, the same one who'd been on the rain barrel, stood a few feet off, wary as a stray dog. "Why not?" "That's the mercantile trough. Mr. Bell don't like folks loitering. He'll come out." "Let him come." The boy shifted from foot to foot. He was maybe 10 gap-toothed with a cowlick that stood straight up. "You really from Boston?" "I really am." "Is it true there's houses there taller than 6 floors? Despite everything, despite the letter and the hotel and the widow and the $4.60. Something in Willa's chest loosened half an inch. Here at last was a person in Copper Creek who wanted to know something about her that wasn't scandal. "There are houses in Boston," she said, "taller than 10 floors. There's a church steeple you can see from the harbor before you can see the land. And in winter, the whole city goes white and quiet, and the snow comes up over the tops of your boots, and your breath hangs in the air like smoke." The boy's eyes had gone round. "You're lying." "I'm not." "Snow up over your boots." "Higher some years." "Well," said a woman's voice sharp as a slap, "isn't this cozy?" The boy scattered like a quail. It was the woman in green. Up close, she was younger than Willa had thought, near her own age, handsome in a hard way, with a jaw set for war. She stood over Willa where she sat on her trunk, and she folded her arms. "You want to tell fairy stories?" the woman said. "You can tell 'em somewhere that isn't the middle of my town." "Your town." "My family's been in Copper Creek since before there was a Copper Creek. And I'll not have some cast-off sitting in the street making a spectacle where every soul can see." "I'm not making a spectacle," Willa said, rising slowly to her feet, so that she was not being loomed over. "I'm sitting on a trunk. If there's a spectacle, ma'am, it's the one your Mr. Walton made this morning when he had a hotel clerk deliver my dismissal instead of facing me himself. That was the spectacle. I only arrived for it." The woman's face did something complicated. And Willa, who had spent all afternoon reading rooms she didn't understand, suddenly understood this one. "You?" she said slowly. "You're the reason." "I don't know what you're the one he expected instead." It came together all at once, clean and cold. "He didn't change his mind about a wife. He changed his mind about which wife. You had a falling out, and he wrote to Boston, and then you made it up, and I was already on the train, so he just let me arrive. Let me get all the way here, and then handed me a letter." She was breathing hard now. "He didn't even have to think about me long enough to stop me. I was just a thing he'd ordered and then sent back." The woman in green had gone very still. "That's not," she said, "how it was." "Then how was it?" And there it was, the first crack, because the woman didn't answer. She looked away up the street, and her jaw worked, and Willa watched a terrible knowledge cross another human face, and knew with absolute certainty that she was right. "He told me you were homely," the woman said finally, very low, "and ill-tempered, and that you'd tricked him with a false description. That's what he told everyone. So I wouldn't." She stopped. "So you wouldn't feel sorry for me. So I wouldn't feel guilty." The woman's eyes came back to Willa's, and there was something raw in them now. "He said it wasn't a real engagement. Just letters. He said any man's allowed to change his mind about letters." "He signed a contract." "I know." "He paid my fare." "I know." The woman pressed her lips together hard. "I have to go," she said, and turned on her heel and walked away fast, and Willa stood beside her trunk in the middle of Front Street and watched her go and thought, there is not one single person in this entire town who will help me. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. The sun was going down when the boots came. She'd heard 100 pairs of boots that afternoon on the platform on the boardwalk, passing her on the street with careful judging steps that slowed just enough to look and then sped up again. She'd stopped hearing them the way you stop hearing a clock. She was sitting on her trunk again. Mr. Bell had come out of the mercantile once, taken one look at her face, and gone back inside without a word, and she was doing arithmetic she'd already done. $4.60. Church floor if the Reverend allowed it. 5 days until Tuesday. And then a train she couldn't afford to a city that had no use for her either. The Boots stopped in front of her. "You've been sitting here since noon." She looked up. A man. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work maybe 30 years old, with a face that had been out in weather. He held his hat in his hands, which no man had done for her all day. His eyes were dark and steady, and they were looking at her, not through her, not past her, not sideways, the way the whole town had looked at her. At her. "I have," she said. "Nobody's helped you." "No." "Nobody's offered you a bed." "No." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected about the town he lived in. "I know what happened this morning. The whole county knows by now. Walton talks." His mouth tightened on the name. "I want you to understand I'm not part of it." Everyone said that today. "I mean it different than they meant it." He crouched down so that he wasn't looking down at her, so that his eyes were level with hers, and Willa felt something in her chest she couldn't name. "They meant don't blame me. I mean I'll do something about it." "There's nothing to be done. I'm leaving Tuesday." "On what money?" She said nothing. "That's what I figured," the man said. He stood back up unhurried and settled his hat back on his head. "My name's Lucas Reed. I've got a place 8 miles north of here, the Double R. Cattle mostly when the drought lets me. I lost my hired woman 2 months back. She married a soldier and went to the fort. I've got a house nobody keeps meals, nobody cooks, and books my mother left that nobody's read since she died." He said it plain like a man reading off a list. "I need work done. You need somewhere to be that isn't a church floor. I'll pay you honest wages, room and board, and when the drought breaks I'll pay more." Willa stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you crossed a country for a man who didn't have the decency to meet your train," Lucas Reed said. "I know you dragged that trunk up and down this street all afternoon and didn't ask a single soul for help. I know you're still sitting up straight." He shrugged one shoulder. "That's enough to know. People will talk. A woman living on your ranch, unmarried. They'll say worse things than they said today." A dry, almost smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Ma'am, I stopped caring what this town says about a while back, but if it troubles you—" He paused, and for the first time something in his steady face flickered some hesitation, and Willa saw that whatever he was about to say cost him. "You can tell them you're my housekeeper. That's the truth of it. Or you can let them think whatever keeps you safe." He looked out at the street at the darkening windows, where he surely knew people were watching. A man's housekeeper is fair game for gossip. A man's wife isn't. Nobody in this county's fool enough to insult a rancher's wife to his face. Willa's breath went out of her. "You're offering to marry me." "No." He said it fast, firm, almost embarrassed. "No, ma'am. I'm offering you a name to hide behind if you want one. Nothing more than that. You'd have your own room, your own key to it if you like. I'd never—" He stopped, jaw tight. "You'd be safe, that's all I'm offering. Safety and honest work, and a door that locks from your side." For the first time all day, Willa Dawson felt the sting behind her eyes threaten to become something more, and she fought it down with everything she had, because she would not cry in front of the one person who'd been kind. "Why?" She managed. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "Lucas." Reed was quiet a moment. "Because he said 11 years ago my mother came out here to marry my father. Mail order, same as you, different man." He looked at her steady. "And when she got off the train my father was there. He took her trunk. He called her his wife in front of the whole town before they were even married, so nobody could shame her. And they had 30 good years." His voice roughened just slightly. "She used to say the whole rest of her life came down to a man who lifted a trunk. So." He held out his hand, not to shake, she realized, but toward the trunk at her feet. I can take your trunk, if you're willing to come with me. Willa looked at the hand, at the man, at the town going dark around them, full of people who'd watched her humiliation like a Sunday show, and given her nothing. And she thought about the church floor, and she thought, this is either the kindest thing anyone has ever offered me, or it's a trap, and I have no way on earth to know which. How do I know, she said, that you're not worse than the man I came here for? Lucas Reed didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just nodded like it was a fair question, the first fair thing anyone had granted her all day. You don't? He said. Not yet. But there's a difference between us you can check for yourself. He crouched again, level with her. Walton had 4 months of your letters. He knew everything about you. And when you finally stood in front of him, he sent a note. He held her eyes. I've known you an hour, and I'm still here. Willa Dawson stood up. Then take the trunk, she said. But understand me, Mr. Reed. I'm not a woman who came out here broken and grateful. I came out here broken and angry. And if I go with you, I go as your equal, or I don't go at all. Something moved in his face, surprise, and under it respect. Equal it is, Lucas Reed said, and lifted her trunk to his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. They didn't speak much on the ride out. He'd brought a wagon, and he handed her up onto the seat with a formality that surprised her, and then he climbed up the other side and clicked to the horses, and they went north out of Copper Creek in the last of the light. Willa sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the town fall away behind them, and felt for the first time in 11 hours that she could take a full breath. You'll want to know the terms, Lucas said when the town was gone. So there's no misunderstanding later. I would. $15 a month board and room. You cook, you keep the house, you tend the kitchen garden if the water lasts. That's the work. The rest. He kept his eyes on the horses. The rest is just for the town's benefit. In front of folks, you're Mrs. Reed. On the ranch, you're Miss Dawson, and I'm Reed, and there's a locked door between us. I won't come through it, and I won't ask to. You have my word, and out here a man's word is about all he's got. And when I leave, he glanced at her. You planning to leave? I don't know what I'm planning. Yesterday I was planning to be married. He took that without offense. When you leave, he said, you leave. No hold on you. I'll drive you to the depot myself and pay the fare to wherever you're going. All I ask is, you tell me straight so I can find someone else before you go. Willa turned this over. It was, she realized, a better arrangement than the marriage she'd crossed the country for. There was no love in it, but there was also no lie in it, and after today, she thought she might trust honesty more than affection. There's one thing, Lucas said. One thing I should tell you before we get there so you don't hear it wrong later. Something in his voice made her look at him. I said I lost my hired woman 2 months back, he said. That's true, but she's not the reason the house needs keeping. He was quiet a moment, the horses' hooves loud in the dark. My father died in the spring. My mother 3 years before that. It's just me out here now, has been, and a man alone on a ranch. He stopped, started again. There's a lot of hours after dark, that's all. The house needs keeping because I haven't had a reason to keep it. I let it go. It was not quite what he'd started to say. Willa was sure of that. But she didn't press. There'd been enough today of people prying open other people's wounds for sport. I can keep a house, was all she said. I know you can. You told the widow so. Word gets around. Something almost like humor in it. 3 languages. You heard about that. Ma'am, by 4 o'clock this afternoon, the whole town had heard you speak 3 languages, sass Delia Ashford in the street, and make the bellboy cry about snow. Now it was definitely humor. You made more of an impression in 1 day than most folks make in a year. Delia Ashford, the woman in green. That's her. She's the one Walton wanted instead of me. Lucas's hands went still on the reins for just a second. Then they moved again. So that's true. Folks said, but I didn't know if... He shook his head. That's a low thing, even for him. You don't like him? No. Just the one word, flat and final, and Willa understood there was a whole history behind it she wasn't going to get tonight. They rode on in the dark, and after a while, she saw a light ahead, a single lit window, low against the ground, and Lucas said, "That's the double R." And something in the way he said it, half pride and half grief, told her more about the man beside her than an hour of talking would have. The house was too big for one man, and too empty for a home. She saw that the moment she stepped inside, before she'd even taken off her coat. A good house well built, the kind a man builds when he expects a family to fill it, and every room half dark and gone quiet. Dishes stacked in the basin, a coat over a chair that had been there long enough to keep the shape of the chair. A house that had been loved once, and then just stopped. "It's not much to look at," Lucas said, setting her trunk down. "It's more than a church floor," Willa said, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound like a man who hadn't done it in a while and had forgotten the shape of it. He showed her the room. It was his mother's, she understood without being told. There was still a hairbrush on the dresser and a shawl on a hook. He didn't explain it, and she didn't ask. He showed her the key. He put it in her hand and folded her fingers over it, and then, as if realizing he'd touched her, stepped back fast. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "There's flour, coffee, salt, pork beans. Eggs if the hens cooperate. I eat at dawn and at dusk, and I'm not particular. There's a well, water's low but it's clean. I'll be in the barn most days." He was retreating toward the door as he spoke, hat back in his hands. "You need anything? I'm never far." "Mr. Reed." He stopped. "Thank you," Willa said. I've said thank you 50 times today to people who didn't earn it. This is the first time I've meant it." Lucas Reed looked at her across the lamp-lit room, this stranger, this rejected woman he'd found sitting on a trunk in the road, and something passed over his weathered face that she couldn't read. "Get some sleep, Miss Dawson," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's easier than today. Most days are." And he went out and closed the door, and she heard his boots go down the porch steps and away toward the barn. Willa stood alone in a dead woman's bedroom, in a stranger's house, 8 miles from a town that hated her. And she did not feel afraid. That was the thing she'd remember later, when everything came apart and came back together, that on the worst day of her life, in the strangest place she'd ever been, she'd set down her trunk and turned the key in a door that locked from her side, and for the first time since Boston, she'd felt safe. She should have known it couldn't last, because 8 miles south in a town gone dark, James Walton was sitting in the back room of the feed store with a glass of whiskey and the news that the Boston woman he'd thrown away had climbed into Lucas Reed's wagon in front of half the county. And James Walton did not like to lose things, even things he'd thrown away. She woke before dawn out of pure habit and lay a moment in the strange bed listening. Then she heard it, a sound from the yard, low and terrible, an animal in distress, and she was up and moving before she'd decided to out of the room through the dark kitchen onto the porch in her nightclothes, with a shawl grabbed off the hook. In the gray first light, she saw Lucas at the corral, and a horse down on its side in the dust thrashing, and Lucas kneeling at its head with his whole weight talking to it low, and blood, too much blood, black in the half-light soaking into the dirt. What happened? She was down the steps and across the yard before she thought about her bare feet. "Wire." His voice was tight. "Somebody cut my fence in the night. She got tangled in it in the dark, panicked, tore herself up bad." He looked up at her, and there was something in his face beyond the horse now, something colder. "Fences don't cut themselves, Miss Dawson." "What do you need?" "You should go back inside. This isn't. What do you need?" He looked at her, and the woman in a shawl and bare feet, who wasn't going anywhere, and something shifted in his eyes. "There's a bag in the barn," he said. "Leather by the door. Needle catgut carbolic. And clean rags all you can find. Go." She went. She ran. And when she came back with the bag and an armful of rags, she didn't hand them over and step away like a lady. She knelt down in the bloody dust across from him and threaded the needle in the growing light, while he held the animal's head, and when he said, "You'll have to hold the wound closed while I stitch. Can you do that?" She said yes, and she did her hands slick and red, her jaw set, and she did not look away once. They worked in silence as the sun came up. When it was done, when the horse lay breathing steady, stitched and bandaged, and Lucas sat back on his heels with his forearms red past the elbow, he looked at her across the animal for a long moment. "You said equal," he said. "Last night. I didn't think you meant this." "I meant all of it," Willa said, and Lucas Reed looked at her. This Boston woman with blood on her hands and a dead woman's shawl on her shoulders and no fear in her at all, and Willa saw him decide something about her that she wouldn't fully understand for a long time. "Somebody cut my fence to hurt me," he said low. "First time in 11 years anyone's done that, and it happened the same night I brought you home." He stood and helped her up and held her bloody hand a beat longer than he needed to. "I don't much believe in coincidence, Miss Dawson." "Neither do I," she said. And 8 miles south, James Walton was already telling anyone who'd listen that Lucas Reed had stolen the woman he'd been promised, that a contract was a contract, that the Boston girl belonged to him, and that he meant to get back what was his. But Willa Dawson didn't know that yet. All she knew was that she'd knelt in the blood and the dust beside a man who saw her, truly saw her, and that whatever was coming for the two of them, she wasn't going to face it, sitting down. Not anymore. She'd done enough sitting to last a lifetime. She was standing now. And she wasn't going to stop. The horse lived. That was the first thing Willa learned to be proud of at the Double R, that a thing everyone would have shot she and Lucas Reed had saved with catgut and stubbornness and the whole of a sunrise. But the fence stayed cut, and both of them knew what that meant. "You could tell the sheriff," she said 3 mornings later, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. He'd come in from riding the line with dust in the creases of his face and a rifle he hadn't carried before across his saddle. "A man cuts your fence, that's a crime. Sheriff in Copper Creek is Walton's cousin." Lucas said it without heat, the way a man states the weather. "I ride in to report a cut fence. I'll spend the morning explaining why a woman's living in my house and get told to mind my own wire." His cousin. His mother's sister's boy. Half the men with any say in that town owed James Walton money or married into his kin. He forked eggs 8 and looked up at her. "You want to understand Copper Creek, Miss Dawson? That's it in one sentence. Walton owns the feed store, the freight contract, and most of the paper on most of the ranches for 40 miles. Man doesn't need a badge when he's got the notes." Willa sat down across from him. She'd stopped asking permission to sit at his own table sometime around the second day, and he'd never once suggested she shouldn't. "Then why doesn't he own you?" Something closed in his face. "He'd like to." "That's not an answer." "No." Lucas agreed. "It isn't." And he ate the rest of his eggs in silence, and Willa let him, because she was learning that Lucas Reed gave up the truth the way the drought-cracked ground gave up water slowly, and only under pressure, and never all at once. She was also learning that she liked him. She'd fought it for 3 days. She'd told herself that gratitude wasn't liking that a man giving you a roof when you had none would look like an angel, no matter what he was. That she'd made exactly this mistake once already with a man's handwriting, and had no business making it again with a man's kindness. But it was one thing to keep house for a stranger, and another to kneel in blood beside him at dawn, and after that morning something had changed that couldn't change back. She'd seen him afraid for a suffering animal. She'd seen him gentle. You couldn't unsee a thing like that. So she watched him eat his eggs, and she thought, "Be careful, Willa. You know exactly how this ends when you trust a man too fast." Then she got up and washed the dishes and started her day, because a woman could be careful and still have work to do. The work, at least she understood. She'd found the house in mourning, and she brought it back to life, a room at a time. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been scrubbed in a year. She beat rugs until the dust hung in the air like a storm. She found his mother's linens yellowed in a trunk and washed them white again, and put them on beds nobody slept in, because a house with clean linens is a house that expects people. She dug the kitchen garden back out of the weeds, and though the water was low, she coaxed beans and squash out of the ground by carrying wash water to them, a cupful, at a time when Lucas wasn't looking. He noticed anyway. "You're watering that garden with the dishwater," he said one evening, catching her at it. "The soap's good for the aphids." That's not why you're doing it. No, she admitted. It's not. It's because I won't waste clean water and I won't let the garden die. Both those things are true at once. Lucas leaned against the porch post and watched her tip the gray water carefully around the bean roots, and there was a look on his face she was starting to recognize, a kind of quiet astonishment, as if she kept being something he hadn't planned for. My mother did that, he said finally. The dishwater. I'd forgotten. His voice went rough on the edge. House has felt like her again this week. I keep coming in and expecting... He stopped, straightened off the post. I'll haul you 2 buckets from the low well tomorrow, for the garden. Don't argue. I wasn't going to argue about free water, Mr. Reed. That'd be a first, he said, and went to the barn, and Willa stood in the dying light and pressed her lips together so she wouldn't smile too wide where he might turn and see it. But the town would not let them alone. It came first, as small things. A neighbor's boy who'd delivered the double R its mail for $1 a month simply stopped coming, and when Lucas rode to ask why the boy's father wouldn't meet his eye, and mumbled something about being too busy. Then the mercantile in Copper Creek Bells, the same Mr. Bell who'd watched Willa on his trough, started running short of things Lucas needed. Out of nails. Out of the coffee he liked. Out of the fencing wire he needed most of all, with a cut line still to mend. Funny, Lucas said, coming back from town with a half-empty wagon and a hard set to his jaw. Bell's had wire in stock every week for 11 years. Sold out the very week I need it. Willa understood before he finished. Walton told him not to sell to you. Walton didn't have to tell him anything. That's the part folks like you never understand about a place like this. He unloaded the little he'd gotten. Nobody gives an order. Bell just looks at how the wind's blowing and decides all on his own he'd rather not be the man who sold wire to Lucas Reed this particular month. Everybody protects themselves, and a man gets squeezed to death by 100 people, all just protecting themselves. A woman too, Willa said quietly. He looked at her, and the anger went out of him, replaced by something more careful. Yeah, he said. A woman too. I know that's what happened to you in town. I'm sorry it's happening again out here on my account. It's not on your account. She lifted her chin. It's on his. I'm done letting men like James Walton make me feel like the trouble I'm standing in is my own fault. And Lucas Reed looked at her for a long moment and said, Where'd you learn to talk like that? Boston, she said. Where a woman with no money and a sharp tongue learns fast that the tongue's the only thing nobody can repossess. He laughed at that, really laughed the second time she'd heard it, and for a moment the squeeze and the cut fence and the empty wagon all felt smaller than they were. The moment didn't last. It was Delia Ashford who broke it, and Willa should have known it would be. She came out on a Sunday in a buggy and a hat, too fine for a dusty ranch road, and she pulled up in the Double R yard, while Lucas was off riding the far pasture, which Willa was certain was not an accident. Delia knew ranch schedules. Delia had probably waited at a bend in the road until she saw Lucas ride out. Miss Dawson, Delia called, not getting down. Or is it Mrs. Reed now? I hear it depends who's asking. Willa came to the edge of the porch and did not invite her down. It's whatever keeps the gossip smallest, Miss Ashford. You'd know something about small gossip, I expect. You feed enough of it. Delia's mouth tightened, but she'd come for a purpose, and she held to it. I came to warn you. Woman to woman. We're not woman to woman. Last we spoke you called me a cast-off in the middle of the street. I was wrong to do that. It clearly cost her. That's part of why I'm here. James. She stopped, gathered herself. James is telling everyone the contract you signed is still good, that you're still promised to him, that Lucas took you in the full knowledge you belong to another man, and that's... Her hands twisted the reins. There's a word for taking another man's promised wife. He's using it, loudly, to anyone in a saloon who'll stand him a drink. The blood went out of Willa's face, then came roaring back hot. He rejected me, in writing. I have the letter. I know. You know you saw him write it. You're the reason he wrote it. I know, Delia said again miserably. That's why I'm here. Because I can't stand what he's turned it into. He rejected you to have me, and now he's decided he wants you back, not because he wants you. Willa, I don't think James Walton has ever wanted a person in his life, but because Lucas Reed has you. And there is nothing on this earth James wants more than a thing Lucas Reed has. And there it was, the crack in the whole story wider now, and Willa stepped toward it. Why? She said slowly. Does James Walton hate Lucas Reed? Delia looked away. You know, Willa said. You know, and you're not saying. I've had one whole week of this town knowing things about my life and not telling me. I'm out of patience for it, Miss Ashford. Why? For a long moment she thought Delia wouldn't answer. Then the other woman drew a breath, and when she spoke her voice was low and fast, the voice of a person saying a thing she'd promised herself never to say. Because Lucas's father held the note on Walton's land. The old man, Reed's father, loaned James's father the money to keep his ranch in a bad year 20 years back. Held it fair, charged him nothing, let it ride. Never called it in. Delia's knuckles were white on the reins. And when old Walton died, he'd never paid a penny of it back. James inherited a ranch that wasn't really his. It was Reed's. On paper, the Double R could have taken the Walton place any day for 15 years, and never did, because old man Reed shook hands with old man Walton, and a handshake meant something to him. Her voice cracked. James has spent his whole life knowing another family could have ruined him with one trip to the courthouse and chose not to. You understand what that does to a man like James? He'd rather be hated than pitied. He'd rather owe you blood than mercy. Willa's mind was racing. The note. Does Lucas still hold it? His father died in the spring. Everything came to Lucas. Delia met her eyes. So yes, somewhere in that house you're keeping Willa Dawson there is a piece of paper that says James Walton's entire life belongs to Lucas Reed, and James knows it. And now James thinks Lucas has taken the last thing. She stopped. You. He's decided you're one more thing Lucas took from him, and he means to take you back to prove he can. The wind moved across the yard. Somewhere a hen complained. I'm not a thing, Willa said very quietly. I'm not a note, and I'm not a ranch, and I'm not the last piece in a card game between two men. And you can tell James Walton I said so. I'm not telling James anything. Delia gathered the reins. I came out here behind his back, and if he learns of it, it'll go badly for me. I told you because... She hesitated, and for the first time looked less like an enemy, and more like a woman, just as trapped as Willa had been on that platform. Because he threw you away to have me, and I let him, and I have to sleep at night. Consider it paid. She turned the buggy and drove out fast, and Willa stood on the porch with a whole new world rearranged around her, holding a single, terrible fact in both hands like a live coal. There is a paper in this house that could destroy James Walton, and James Walton knows it exists. That was why the fence was cut. Not jealousy. Reconnaissance. A man testing how well defended a house was before he came for what was in it. Lucas rode in an hour before dusk, and she met him in the yard before he'd even swung down. And she told him everything Delia had said. All of it. The note, the handshake, the 15 years of mercy that had curdled into hate. And she watched his face go from surprise to something bleak and old. She told you about the note, was all he said. Is it true? It's true. He stepped down heavy like the day had gained weight. It's in the strong box in my father's room. I've read it maybe twice. I've never once thought of using it. My father wouldn't have wanted... He shook his head. It was never a weapon to us. It was just a thing my father did for a neighbor because that's the kind of man he was. Walton's the only one who ever saw it as a weapon, because Walton's the only one who'd have used it. He cut your fence to test you, Willa said. He's going to try for that box. He can try. Lucas's voice had gone flat and dangerous. It's not the box I'm worried about. He looked at her, really looked the way he had at the depot, the way that made her feel like the only real thing in a wide world of pretend. It's you. He spent a week telling the county you belong to him. A man says a thing enough times some folks start believing it. And a man who's decided to take back a thing he threw away. His jaw worked. I brought you here to keep you safe from talk. I didn't reckon on bringing you into the middle of my own war. You didn't bring me into anything, Lucas. His first name came out of her without her deciding to let it, and she saw him register. It saw something move behind his eyes. I walked into it the day I got off that train, and he handed me a letter instead of a life. I was already in this the moment I chose you over a church floor. I just didn't know the name of what I'd chosen. You could still leave, he said. Tuesday's train. I'd pay it like I promised. You'd be shut of the whole, do you want me to leave? The question stopped him cold. For a long moment, Lucas Reed stood in his own yard and said nothing, and Willa watched him wrestle with something, and she understood that whatever he said next was going to be true, because he didn't seem capable of the other kind. No, he said at last low. God help me, I don't. And I've got no right to say it because a man who wanted you safe would put you on that train himself. But you asked, and I won't lie to you because everybody in your life's been lying to you, and I decided the first night I wouldn't be one more. He took a breath. I don't want you to leave, Willa. The house feels like a house again, and He stopped. That's more than I ought to say. I'll stop there. It was the most she'd ever heard him say about himself, and it landed in her chest like a hand pressed flat over her heart. Then I'll stay, she said, and we'll deal with James Walton together, as equals, like I told you at the start. As equals. Lucas agreed, and this time when he held her gaze, it wasn't a stranger looking at a stranger anymore. They ate supper late, and for the first time when the meal was done, neither of them got up right away. They sat at the table with the lamp between them, and they really talked past the terms and the work into the parts of a life a person only shares when they've decided to trust. She told him about Boston, about the fever, about her father's debts, and the men who'd taken everything about answering a matrimonial advertisement because a governess is one bad reference from the street. He told her about his mother, who'd come out on a train same as Willa and made a hard land into a home, about his father who'd worked himself into the ground and shaken a man's hand instead of ruining him, about 11 years of hours after dark in a house that got quieter every year. I stopped keeping it, he said of the house, after Ma died. Couldn't see the point. A man alone doesn't need clean linens. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. And then you show up and wash them white in 3 days, and I walk in tonight and it smells like when I was a boy. And I don't know whether to thank you or ask you to stop because it hurts, Willa. It hurts to have it back. Grief's like that, she said softly. The comfort and the ache come in the same door. You don't get one without the other. I learned that the week I buried both my parents. She reached across the table. She surprised herself doing it and laid her hand over his, over the coffee cup, over 11 years of a lonely man's hours. But you shouldn't have to sit in a dark house to keep from feeling it. That's not honoring them. That's just hiding. Lucas Reed looked down at her hand on his. He didn't pull away. Equal, he said quietly, almost to himself, like a man discovering the word meant something he hadn't understood when he first agreed to it. You keep saying equal. I don't think you know how rare it is a person who'll sit across from you and be equal. Most folks want to be over you or under you. Easier that way. You always know where you stand. He turned his hand over under hers so their palms met. You just want to stand next to a man. I never met anybody who wanted that before. Then you've been meeting the wrong people. I've been meeting Copper Creek people, he said, and she laughed, and he almost smiled, and for one moment in a besieged house on a dying ranch, the two of them were simply happy. It couldn't hold. Nothing good in this story ever seemed able to hold for long. 3 days later, Willa drove the wagon into town alone. Lucas hadn't wanted her to. But the low well had finally gone dry, and the garden and the animals both needed water hauled from the town pump until the windmill Lucas was rebuilding could be finished, and he couldn't be two places at once. And Willa Dawson was not a woman who'd hide in a house while a man did double the work to protect her from gossip. I've been stared at before, she told him. I survived a whole afternoon of it my first day. I can survive a trip to the pump. It's not the staring I'm worried about. I'll take the shotgun. I know how to use it. My father taught me before he decided a lady oughtn't. Some lessons stick past the deciding. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. I'll be back by noon. She was not back by noon. She'd filled the water barrels at the town pump under the eyes of half of Front Street, ignoring them the way she'd learned to ignore them when James Walton stepped down off the boardwalk and stood in front of her team so she couldn't drive on. She knew him at once, though she'd never seen his face. She knew him by the way the street went quiet around him, by the way people found reasons to be elsewhere. He was handsome in the way of men who've always been told they are well-dressed, well-fed, a gold chain across his vest, and he looked at Willa the way a man looks at a horse that got away from him with irritation and appetite in equal measure. So, he said, the famous Boston bride. I've heard so much. You've said so much is what I hear. Willa did not get down. Height was an advantage, and she meant to keep it. You've been telling this town I belong to you. I'd like you to stop. You do belong to me. He smiled, easy sure of himself. We have a contract. Signed. I've had my lawyer look at it. A promise of marriage is binding in this territory, Miss Dawson. You broke it when you took up with Reed. I broke it. She actually laughed. You handed me a letter, Mr. Walton, in your own hand. You are not what I expected. I have it. It's in a safe place, and it has your signature on it, and I imagine your lawyer would find it interesting. Something flickered behind his smile. He hadn't known she'd kept it. He'd assumed a shamed woman would burn a thing like that. That letter, he said, recovering, was written in a moment of weakness, a misunderstanding. I regret it deeply. He put a hand on the wagon rail close to her boot and lowered his voice so the street couldn't hear. Here's what's going to happen, Miss Dawson. You're going to leave Reed's ranch. Today. You're going to come stay respectably at the hotel I'll pay, and in due course we'll be married quiet and proper, and this whole ugly business will be forgotten. You'll be the wife of the richest man in the county instead of the housekeeper of a broke rancher who's one bad season from losing his land. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It's a better offer than you deserve, all things considered. Willa looked down at his hand on her wagon rail. Move your hand, Mr. Walton, she said. I'm making you an offer. You're making me sick. She said it clearly and loud enough that the nearest listeners heard, and she saw him flinch at the volume. You didn't want me when you thought I was homely. You wanted Delia Ashford. You threw me off this same street a week ago and let a whole town watch. And now you want me back, and we both know it has nothing to do with me. It's about a note in a strongbox, and a man named Reed, and a fight you started 20 years ago in your own small heart. I'm not a piece of that fight. I won't be moved around it like a checker. Now move your hand. The street had gone dead silent. James Walton's face changed. The charm dropped off it like a mask coming loose, and underneath was something Willa hadn't let herself fully believe was there until she saw it cold and mean and used to winning. You, he said softly, so only she could hear, are going to be very sorry you said that. Reed can't protect you. Reed can't protect himself. He's mortgaged to the eyes, and I hold half the paper in this county, and I will squeeze that ranch until there's nothing left but you and him standing in the dust. And when that day comes, and it's coming, Boston, you'll walk to me on your own 2 feet and beg for that hotel room. I'll enjoy telling you it's no longer on offer. He stepped back and lifted his hand off the rail with a little mocking flourish and raised his voice for the street. Safe travels, Mrs. Reed. Do give my regards to your husband. And he smiled and turned and walked away, and left Willa sitting on a wagon full of water in a silent town, shaking not with fear she realized, but with a fury so pure and so cold it frightened her a little. She was still shaking when she got the team turned around, and that was when she saw it. She'd meant to drive straight out of town, but her way took her past the feed store. Walton's feed store, and the side door stood open, and through it she saw 2 men she didn't know loading a wagon in a hurry, and she saw what they were loading. Fencing wire. Coils and coils of it. The same wire Bell's Mercantile had suddenly mysteriously run out of the very week Lucas needed it. Walton hadn't just told the town not to sell to Lucas. He'd bought up all the wire himself, cornered it. Every foot of fencing wire in Copper Creek was sitting in James Walton's feed store so that a rancher with a cut fence and cattle to keep couldn't buy a single strand to mend it, could only watch his stock wander through the gap and scatter and be lost one head at a time until the ranch bled out. Squeeze that ranch until there's nothing left. He'd already started. He'd started before he ever stopped her wagon. The fence hadn't been cut to test the house. The fence had been cut to start the bleeding. Willa sat very still on the wagon seat with the reins in her hands and did the thing she was best at in all the world, the thing Boston had trained into her when it took everything else away, she thought, cold and fast and clear. James Walton held the wire. He held the sheriff. He held the notes on half the county. He held every advantage a man could hold. But James Walton had also, in his arrogance, just told her his entire plan out loud on a public street, because he could not imagine a woman being worth the trouble of keeping a secret from. And James Walton did not know that the woman he'd thrown away had spent 4 years as a governess for a Boston lawyer's family, and had read that man's law books at night, for want of anything else to do, and knew for a fact, that cornering a market to ruin a competitor was a thing courts had names for. And that a signed letter of rejection made his claim of a binding contract into a lie any judge could see through in a minute. He'd handed her the letter to shame her. She was starting to think it might be the most useful thing anyone in Arizona had ever given her. She drove home fast, the water sloshing her mind on fire. Lucas met her in the yard, relief and worry warring on his face at the sight of her late and pale. "You're back. What happened? You look—" "Willa, what happened in town?" She climbed down from the wagon and stood in front of him. And she did not fall into his arms the way a rescued woman was supposed to, because she wasn't a rescued woman anymore and hadn't been for a week. "James Walton stopped my wagon in the middle of Front Street," she said, "and told me I belonged to him and threatened to squeeze this ranch to dust, and I told him to move his hand." Lucas's face went white and then dark, but she kept on before he could speak. "And then he made a mistake, Lucas. A bad one. He told me exactly how he means to do it, and on my way out of town, I saw the rest of it with my own eyes." She took a breath. "He's got every foot of fencing wire in the county locked in his feed store. That's why Bell ran out. That's why your fence being cut matters so much. He wants your cattle to walk out through a gap you can't mend and scatter across the territory till you've got no herd and no ranch and no fight left in you." Lucas stared at her. "How do you—" "Because I saw the wire being loaded, and because I know how men like him think, and because I spent 4 years reading a lawyer's books by candlelight while I raised his children." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped, and it shook now with something that wasn't fear at all. "He thinks he's already won. He thinks I'm a scared woman he can move around a board. He looked at me today and saw a thing he owns." Her eyes came up to his, blazing. "He has no idea what he just handed me, Lucas. He has no idea at all." And Lucas Reed looked at the woman standing in his yard. Not broken, not grateful, not rescued, but armed. Armed with something he was only beginning to understand. And for the first time since James Walton had cut his fence in the dark, he felt the ground shift back under his own feet. "What did he hand you?" he asked. Willa Dawson smiled, and it was not a soft smile. "A confession," she said. "In front of the whole street. And a signed letter in his own hand that makes a liar out of everything he told his lawyer. He spent a week telling this county I belong to him." She turned toward the house, toward the strongbox, toward the fight that was coming. "By the time I'm finished, he's going to wish he'd meant that letter." The strongbox opened with a key Lucas kept on a leather thong around his neck, and Willa understood, watching him lift it over his head, that he'd been carrying his father's whole legacy against his chest every single day without once thinking to use it. Inside were the papers of a life, a deed, a will. His mother's marriage lines brought all the way from wherever she'd started, and near the bottom, folded in oilcloth, a single sheet gone soft at the creases, the note. Willa lifted it out with careful fingers and read it in the lamplight, and her lawyer-trained eyes moved down the lines, and she felt her breath catch. "Lucas?" She looked up. Do you know what this says? It says my father loaned old Walton money. I told you that. It says more than that. She laid it flat on the table. It's not just a loan. It's secured against the Walton land, all of it at the original valuation. Your father never adjusted it. 20 years of interest at the rate written here, unpaid, compounded. She was doing the arithmetic even as she spoke, the numbers falling into place like tumblers in a lock. Lucas, the debt is worth more than the whole Walton ranch is worth today. If you called this in and he couldn't pay, and he can't, nobody could. A court wouldn't just take part of his land. It would take all of it. The feed store, the freight contract, the notes he holds on everyone else, because those are his assets, and his assets would go to satisfy this. She sat back slowly. You're not a man who could ruin James Walton. You're a man who already owns him and never collected. Lucas was very still. My father didn't want. I know what your father wanted. She said it gently because she could see the war in him. Your father wanted to be a good man, and he was. He held mercy in his hand for 20 years and never made a fist of it. She covered the note with her palm. But your father is gone, Lucas, and the man he was merciful to has spent every one of those 20 years hating him for it, and now that man is trying to bleed this ranch dry and take you back a wife you didn't steal. Mercy was your father's to give. It was never Walton's to be owed forever. You're saying I should call the note. I'm saying you can. And that James Walton, who thinks he holds every card in this county, is going to find out that the man he despises has been holding the only one that matters the whole time. She folded the note back into its oilcloth. But not yet. If we move now in anger, we're just two people against his sheriff, and his lawyer, and his money. We need it clean. We need it public. We need him to overreach so far in front of so many people that even Copper Creek can't pretend not to see. And how do we make a man like that overreach? Willa's mouth curved. We don't. He'll do it himself. Men like Walton always do. All we have to do is stop being afraid of him and let him get frustrated and wait. She tucked the note away and slid the box back to Lucas. A frightened person is predictable. He's counting on us being frightened. The moment we stop, he loses the map he's been steering by. But being unafraid, Willa learned over the following days, was easier to declare at a lamplit table than to live under a siege. Because Walton did squeeze, just as he'd promised. The cattle came first. With the fence still gapped and no wire to be had for 40 miles, Lucas's stock drifted through the break by 2s and 3s, wandering onto open range, and more than once onto Walton land, where Lucas discovered they were promptly impounded under an old territorial ordinance about stray livestock, with a fee to reclaim each head that ran higher than the animal was worth. He's not stealing them, Lucas said, coming back empty-handed from Walton's South Range, where 9 of his cows now stood in a Walton pen. That'd be a crime. He's impounding them, legal as Sunday, and charging me more to get 'em back than I'd make selling 'em. He threw his hat on the table. It's genius is what it is. I can't even be angry at it out loud without sounding like a man who lets his fences go. So we mend the fence. With what wire he's got it all. Then we mend it with what we have. And Willa, who had watched her father's creditors take everything and had learned in that season exactly how the poor make do, walked him out to the barn and started pulling down every length of rope, every scrap of old wire, every green sapling that could be cut and woven, and the two of them spent 3 brutal days building a fence out of nothing. A patchwork ugly thing, but a thing that held, and every cow that stayed home was $1 out of James Walton's plan. He escalated. Bell's Mercantile stopped extending Lucas any credit at all. Cash only. And then, when Lucas paid cash, Bell was suddenly out of everything Lucas asked for every single time until it became a kind of joke, and then stopped being funny. The blacksmith wouldn't shoe the double R horses. The man who'd bought Lucas's beef for 3 years sent word he'd found another supplier. One by one, the ordinary threads that tied a ranch to the world around it were cut quietly by men who wouldn't meet Lucas's eye, each of them just protecting himself exactly as Lucas had said, and each of them tightening the noose a little without ever admitting there was one. He's going to win, Lucas said one night. Lowe staring at the ledger where the numbers had stopped adding up in his favor. Not with a gun, not with the sheriff, just with 1,000 small cuts and a whole county too scared to sell me a sack of flour. And there's nothing to fight Willa. That's what he's counting on. You can't shoot a man for not selling you nails. No, Willa agreed. But you're looking at it wrong. You're counting what he's taking from you. Count what he's spending. Lucas looked up. He's buying wire he doesn't need, she said. Paying 2 men to load and haul it. Impounding cattle costs him feed and water, and men to tend them. He's turned half the county against you, but every merchant who won't sell to you is a merchant who's lost a paying customer to please a bully. And merchants remember that even when they're too scared to say so. He's not winning cheap, Lucas. He's winning expensive. And a man winning expensive against a man who's already broke is a man burning his own house to smoke out a mouse. She tapped the ledger. Let him spend. Let him make himself the man who cornered the wire and starved a neighbor and jailed cows. Every ugly thing he does is a witness we don't have to pay. Witnesses to what? To the story we tell when the time comes. Because it's coming, Lucas. He's angry now. Angry that I sassed him on the street. Angry that you won't fold. Angry that a broke rancher and a cast-off bride are still standing when he expected us on our knees weeks ago. Her eyes were steady. An angry man makes the mistake. We just have to still be standing when he does. They were still standing. That in the end was what broke James Walton's patience. Not any move they made, but the simple maddening fact that they made none. That the ranch bled and held. That the woman he'd shamed drove into town with her chin up and bought nothing and left. That Copper Creek watched the double R refuse to die, and began here and there, in ones and twos, to wonder why a rich man was working so hard to kill it. And so James Walton did the thing Willa had promised he would. He overreached. It came on a Saturday, the biggest day in town, when Front Street was thick with ranch families in for supplies, and the saloons were full, and every soul in the county was somewhere they could see. Willa and Lucas had driven in together. She'd insisted, said it was time they stopped hiding. Said a couple that skulks looks guilty, and a couple that walks the boardwalk looks like a couple. They were coming out of the church of all places where Willa had gone to speak with the Reverend about something she wouldn't yet explain to Lucas, when Walton stepped into the middle of Front Street with the sheriff at his side, and half the county watching, and made his play. Lucas Reed. Walton's voice carried pitched for the crowd. I've come to settle this in front of witnesses like honest men. That woman beside you is bound to me by a signed contract of marriage. I've been patient. I've been more than fair. But you've kept another man's promised wife under your roof for a month, and this town knows what that makes you and what it makes her. He turned, playing to the street. Sheriff Coyle, I'm asking you to enforce the contract. Remove Miss Dawson to respectable lodging until the matter's settled at law. The Sheriff Walton's cousin, heavy and uncomfortable, shifted his weight. Now, James, I don't know that I can just... You can, and you will. Walton's charm was gone. Or I'll remember which of us holds the note on your brother's place come the fall. The threat landed in the open in front of everyone, and Willa saw a dozen faces in the crowd go tight. Every one of them a person who owed James Walton something. Every one of them suddenly imagining their own name in that sentence. And she stepped forward before Lucas could, because this was her fight first, and she'd promised herself she'd never again let a man speak for her on this street. You want to settle it in front of witnesses, Mr. Walton? Her voice rang out clear, and heads turned because a woman speaking up to James Walton was worth turning for. Good, so do I. Let's settle all of it, in front of everyone, right now. Walton's smile came back indulgent. By all means. Tell these good people about our contract. Let's start with this contract. She reached into her coat and drew out a folded paper and held it up so the street could see. Here it is, signed by both of us, a promise of marriage. Mr. Walton's quite right, it's binding in this territory. She let that sit a moment, let him think he'd won it. Then she drew out a second paper. And here is the letter Mr. Walton handed me at this very depot 1 month ago in his own hand, releasing me from that contract. You are not what I expected, I will not marry you." She read it loud, and a ripple went through the crowd, because half of them had watched that morning, and none of them had known she'd kept the proof. A contract broken by the man who wrote it isn't a contract a court will enforce, Mr. Walton. Your own lawyer will tell you that if he hasn't already, and if he hasn't, you should stop paying him. Laughter broke out somewhere in the crowd, quick and startled, and she saw Walton's jaw clench. "You didn't lose me, sir. You threw me away, in writing. And you don't get to change your mind about a woman the way you'd change your mind about a horse you sold too cheap." "That letter," Walton bit out, "was a private communication. Then why did you hand it to me on a public platform in front of this whole town you wanted them to watch? You wanted me shamed." Well, she turned slowly to the crowd, and there was no shame in her at all, and they could all see it. "Here I am, a month later, still standing, keeping a good man's house and mending his fences with rope because the man accusing me of scandal has bought up every foot of wire in this county to starve that ranch to death." A murmur sharper now. "How many of you tried to buy fencing wire this month? How many of you were told Bell was out?" Hands didn't rise. People were too frightened for that. But Willa saw the looks pass between them, saw the arithmetic starting in a dozen minds. At once, saw Bell himself go pale at the edge of the crowd. Walton felt the ground move and lunged to hold it. "This is a woman's hysteria and a broke man's excuses. Coyle, remove her. Now." And the sheriff, trapped between his cousin's threat and a street full of witnesses, put his hand on his belt and took a step toward Willa. And Lucas. Reed moved for the first time, stepping between them, and the whole street held its breath, waiting for the thing that gets men killed in towns like this. "Lucas?" Willa's voice low without turning. "No, don't give him that. That's the thing he wants. A man throwing punches is a man he can jail." Lucas stopped shaking with the effort of it. "Let me finish." She turned back to Walton, and now she reached into her coat a third time and drew out a third paper still folded and did not open it. "You want to talk about what people owe, Mr. Walton, about contracts and debts and who's bound to whom. All right." Her voice dropped, but the street was so silent it carried anyway. "Let's talk about what you owe. Let's talk about the note your father signed 20 years ago, borrowing from a man named Reed to save a ranch he couldn't run and never paid back, not a penny, for 20 years. She watched the color drain out of James Walton's face, watched it go from red to gray in the space of a breath, and knew he hadn't imagined she'd found it. Hadn't imagined a woman would understand. It hadn't imagined the shame he'd carried in secret. His whole life was about to be spoken on the street he owned. Compounded at the rate written on it, that debt is worth more than everything you have. The ranch, the store, the freight line. Every note you hold on every frightened person standing here. Another ripple. Bigger half the crowd owed Walton, and half the crowd had just realized Walton owed Reed and owed him more. The Reed family could have taken it all any day for 20 years. And do you know why they didn't? She held the folded note up unopened, and her voice cracked with something real. Because Lucas's father shook your father's hand, and to a Reed that meant something. That's the man you've spent your life hating. A man who held your whole life in his hand and chose to be kind. And you've hated him for it because you can't stand being shown mercy by a better man. The silence on Front Street was total. James Walton stood in the middle of it, unmasked his whole secret, bleeding out in the open. And Willa watched him understand that everything had turned, that the crowd he'd summoned to shame her had become a jury. That the sheriff at his side was quietly taking his hand off his belt. That a month of small cruelties had just been named out loud by a woman he'd dismissed as a thing he owned. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had no bottom to it. "There's no such note." "There is." Lucas spoke for the first time, and his voice was quiet and terrible. "It's real. It's in my father's hand, and yours father's, and it's witnessed, and it's mine now. She's right about every word of it, James. And you know she is, because you've spent 20 years waiting for the day a Reed would finally use it." He stepped forward. Well, here's the day. And here's the thing that's going to eat you alive. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I'm still not going to. Walton stared at him. I could take everything you have right now in front of this whole street, Lucas said. You just tried to take a woman off the boardwalk by force. You've spent a month trying to starve me off my land. And I'm holding the paper that ends you, and I'm telling you and everybody here I'm not going to use it. Because I'm my father's son, and to us that note was never a weapon. It was a kindness. A good man did a bad one. His jaw tightened. But hear me, James. That's not the same as forgiveness. And it's not the same as fear. I'm not calling the note because I choose not to. Not because you scare me, and not because you own this town. The day you touch her or my land, or one more head of my cattle, I'll drive to the territorial court myself and file it. And there's not a judge in Arizona who'll side with a man who cornered wire to starve a neighbor and tried to drag a woman off a public street. You've made your witnesses, James. Look at them. You made every one of them yourself. And James Walton looked at the street full of faces that a month ago had been his, at the merchants doing the arithmetic, at the sheriff who'd stepped back at the debtors, realizing the man they feared was himself a debtor, at the woman he'd thrown away, standing straight-backed and unbroken beside the man he hated most in the world, and something in him broke that Willa almost pitied. Almost. This isn't finished, Walton said, but it was the voice of a man saying it to himself. It is for today, Willa said. Go home, Mr. Walton. Count what this cost you. He went. He turned stiff as an old man, though he wasn't 40, and he walked back through a crowd that parted for him. Now, not out of respect, but out of the particular distaste people feel for a bully they've just watched lose. And he did not look back, and the street let out its breath as one. But it wasn't over. Willa had known it wouldn't be no matter what she'd said to send him off. A man like Walton didn't count his losses and go quiet. A man like Walton went home and got mean. She just didn't expect it that same night. They'd barely finished a late quiet supper. Both of them still lit up and shaking from the street, both of them saying it went well better than they'd hoped the town had seen when the dogs went off in the yard, frantic, and then came the sound that stops a rancher's heart worse than any gunshot. The bellow of terrified cattle, and under it low and growing a sound like wind that wasn't wind. Lucas was up and out the door before Willa reached the window, and when she got to the porch, she saw it out past the patchwork fence out in the dry brush of the South Range, a line of orange crawling along the ground low and fast, throwing up a wall of smoke into the black sky. Fire. He wouldn't, Willa breathed. In a drought that could take the whole county he wouldn't, but he had. Someone had. A dry season, a beaten man, a ranch he couldn't strangle fast enough, and a match was faster than a lawsuit. The fire was between the herd and the only water, and it was moving toward the barn, toward the house, toward everything, and Lucas was already running for the horses, shouting for her to get the animals out. And Willa Dawson stood 1/2 second on the porch of the home she'd rebuilt from a dead woman's silence, and watched James Walton's answer come for all of it at once. And then she stopped watching and grabbed the shotgun and the water buckets and ran toward the fire. She reached the fence line with the buckets banging against her legs and understood in an instant that buckets were a joke against a thing this size. The fire wasn't a wall. It was a living animal, and it was hungry, and it was moving faster than a man could run. The brake. Lucas was shouting from horseback, wheeling toward her. We can't put it out. We cut a brake and starve it. Get the plow. The horses, anything that'll turn ground, we make a strip of bare dirt. It can't cross. Where? The dry wash 40 yards on if we can get the ground bare between the fire and the barn before it jumps the wash. He was already gone, driving the panicked cattle away from the flame with his hat and his voice, and Willa dropped the useless buckets and ran for the barn, for the plow, for the second team doing sums as she ran, because 40 yards of bare ground cut by hand in the dark ahead of a fire that moved like water was arithmetic that came out. No. Every way she added it. 2 people could not do this. 2 people were going to lose everything and maybe their lives, and she knew it, and she harnessed the team anyway, because the alternative was to stand still and let it burn. And then over the roar of it, she heard something that didn't belong. Hoofbeats. Many of them. A lot of horses coming hard up the ranch road from the direction of town. Her first thought was Walton, that he'd come to watch to make sure to finish it, and she swung the shotgun up off her shoulder before she'd even turned. But the shapes that came pounding into the firelight weren't hired men. They were ranch families. 12 of them. 24. Men she half recognized from Front Street men who'd refused to sell Lucas nails a week ago, coming off their horses at a dead run with wet sacks and shovels and their own plow teams, and at the front of them, of all people, old Mrs. Pruitt of the Blue Door, driving a buckboard full of soaked blankets like the wrath of God in an apron. "Where's your brake, Reed?" a big man bellowed. Willa knew him. It was the blacksmith who wouldn't shoe the horses. "You cut a line yet?" The wash. Lucas's voice cracked with something that wasn't the smoke. "We're cutting to the wash." "Then quit standing there." And Copper Creek. The town that had watched Willa's shame like a Sunday show. The town that had run out of wire and credit and courage. The town that had let one man's fear make cowards of them all came apart from Walton's grip in a single night, and fell on that fire with everything it had. They cut the brake. 20 men and their teams turned 40 yards of ground to bare dirt in the time it would have taken Willa and Lucas to turn 5. They beat the edges with wet sacks. The women ran a bucket line from the stock tank Willa had kept full. Mrs. Pruitt directed it all from her buckboard, in a voice that could strip paint, and when a tongue of flame jumped the wash and caught the dry grass on the near side, 6 men threw themselves on it with blankets and stamped it dead before it could take. Willa fought beside them, black to the elbows, her hair singed, swinging a wet sack until her arms had no more swing in them, and then swinging it anyway. And somewhere in the middle of the worst of it, in the smoke, and the shouting and the animal terror of the fire, she felt something she had not felt one single time since she'd stepped off that train. She felt like she belonged to a place. The fire died an hour before dawn. It died at the break exactly where Lucas had said to cut it on a strip of bare Arizona dirt turned by the hands of people who a day earlier wouldn't sell him a sack of flour. The South Range was black and smoking, and the grass was gone, and there'd be lean months ahead, but the barn stood. The house stood. The herd driven north by Lucas in the first frantic minutes stood bawling and terrified and alive against the far fence. They'd lost pasture. They hadn't lost the ranch. Willa stood in the gray light among 40 exhausted people, and she looked at their soot-black faces, and she found she couldn't speak. It was the blacksmith who spoke. He came up to Lucas, wiping his face with a filthy sleeve, and he didn't apologize because men like him don't, but he said the thing that stood in for it. "I got wire," he said gruffly. "Ordered a spool for my own use back before all this. It's yours, and I'll shoe your horses Monday. You bring 'em in." He hesitated and looked at the black range and looked away. "A man cornering wire is one thing. I told myself that weren't my business. But a man burns a neighbor's range in a drought and puts every spread in the county at risk." He shook his head. "That's not business. That's just a man who don't care who else burns as long as he wins. We all seen it now. Can't unsee it." And one by one, that was the thing that had changed. Not that they'd stopped fearing Walton, but that they'd stood in his firelight and understood all at once that a man willing to burn a drought-dry range to win a grudge was a man who would sooner or later burn them too. Fear of Walton had held the town, but fear of the fire he'd set had broken it because it was a bigger fear and a truer one. "How do we know it was Walton?" Willa asked quietly as the families began to gather their teams in the dawn. "We believe it, but believing isn't proof. A court wants proof." It was Mrs. Pruitt who answered, climbing down stiff from her buckboard. "Because I saw his man do it," she said. The whole yard went still. "Couldn't sleep," the old woman went on. "Old women don't. I was up sitting at my window like I do, and I seen Cy Perkins Walton's teamster, one of the 2 loads the wire. I seen him ride out the Copper Creek Road near midnight with something in a sack across his saddle. Coal oil, I'd wager, by the way it sloshed. I thought it queer. Then I saw the glow start up north an hour on, and I knew, and I started knocking on doors. Her jaw set. I'll say it to a judge. I'll say it to the territorial governor if you drag him out here. I've held my tongue in that town for 40 years to keep my borders. I'm too old to be afraid of James Walton, and too near my grave to meet my maker having watched a thing like this and said nothing. Willa crossed the yard to the old woman who'd once turned her away with real regret, and she took both of Mrs. Pruitt's soot-blackened hands in hers. "You turned me away once," Willa said. "You said it didn't matter what you thought, only what the town would do." "I remember. You just changed what the whole town does, in one night." Willa's voice shook. "Don't ever tell me again that what one person thinks doesn't matter." The old woman's chin trembled once, and then she pulled her hands free and swatted the air, because she was not a woman for scenes. "Get on with you, and put something on those burns before they fester." But her eyes were wet, and Willa saw it and let her keep her pride. The sun came up on a black range and a saved ranch and a town that had picked its side. They didn't ride for the sheriff. Sheriff Coyle was Walton's cousin, and no one trusted him to arrest his own kin. Instead, and this was Willa's doing the errand she'd run to the church. She wouldn't explain the reverend who had heard her out 2 days before, and quietly disliked James Walton for reasons of his own. Going back years had already sent word to the circuit judge, who rode into the territory but 4 times a year, and happened by a piece of luck, Willa chose to call Providence to be holding court in the county seat that very week. Willa had gone to the church to ask one question: if we had proof of a crime, and the sheriff wouldn't act. Is there any law above him? And the reverend had told her about the circuit judge and the territorial marshal who rode with him, who answered to no local man's notes and no local man's fear. She'd planted that seed 2 days before the fire. She just hadn't known she'd need the harvest so soon. They rode for the county seat that afternoon, Lucas, Willa, Mrs. Pruitt, in her buckboard, the blacksmith, and behind them, falling in along the road, as word spread, a line of ranch families that grew the way a creek grows in a storm, until by the time they reached the courthouse, it wasn't a complaint anymore. It was a county. Willa laid it out for the judge herself, because Lucas asked her to, because the words were hers, and always had been. She laid out the contract and the letter that broke it. She laid out the cornered wire and named the merchants who'd testify if promised protection. She laid out the impounded cattle and the ordinance twisted to do it. She laid out Mrs. Pruitt's midnight witness of Cy Perkins and the sloshing sack. And she laid the note on the table last, the 20-year debt the Mercy never called. Not as a weapon, she told the judge, but as motive, because a court that understood why James Walton had spent a month trying to destroy a neighbor would understand everything else. "And the man who holds this note," the judge said, turning it in his hands, an old man with a face like a closed ledger, "wishes to enforce it." "No, Your Honor." Lucas spoke up. "I don't. My father held it 20 years and never did. I'd have gone another 20. I brought it only so you'd understand there was a reason behind the fire, and it wasn't madness. It was hate. Old hate. I'd rather forgive the debt entirely and be done with it than see it used against him now. All I want is my range safe and this woman left in peace." The judge looked at Lucas Reed a long moment over the top of his spectacles. "Son," he said, "in 30 years on this bench, I have watched a great many men bring me a paper that made them rich and beg me to make it richer. You are the first who ever brought me a paper that made you rich and asked me to help him give it away." He set the note down. "I'll want to meet your late father in my prayers tonight. He raised a rare thing." They arrested James Walton the next morning. The territorial marshal did it, not the sheriff, and he did it in front of the feed store with half the county there to see, and Cy Perkins had already broken under 2 hours of the marshal's questions and named Walton as the man who'd handed him the coal oil and told him where to pour it. Arson in a drought was a hanging offense in that territory, or near enough that Perkins had traded everything he knew for his own neck, and everything he knew was more than enough. Willa did not go to watch. She'd thought she'd want to. She found when the morning came that she didn't. There was no triumph in it for her, only a tiredness and a strange, quiet grief for a man who'd been handed mercy by a whole family, and had hated them for it until it burned him down. Delia Ashford came out to the ranch the day after the arrest. She came alone in her buggy, and this time she got down. She stood in the yard a while before she found her voice, and when she did, it was small. "I'm not going to marry him now," she said. "Obviously." "No," Willa agreed. "I don't expect you are. I want you to know I didn't know about the fire. Whatever else I did, the things I said to you on the street, letting him tell people you were homely, all of it. I didn't know he'd—" She stopped. "I'd have stopped him. If I'd known. I want you to believe that." Willa looked at the woman who'd called her a cast-off, who was also the woman who'd driven out behind Walton's back to warn her who'd been just as trapped in that town's fear as anyone. "I believe you," she said. "You came to warn me once when it cost you something. A person who'll do that isn't a person who'd light a fire." She paused. "What will you do now?" Delia laughed, short and bitter and free. "Leave. There's nothing here for me but a ruined engagement, and a lot of people who watched me nearly marry an arsonist. I've got a sister in Santa Fe." She looked around the yard at the black range beyond at the standing barn. "You made this happen, you know. All of it. He'd have won. He always won. And a Boston woman with no money and a signed letter took him apart on his own street." She shook her head. "I misjudged you worse than anyone. I'm sorry for it. Go to Santa Fe," Willa said, not unkindly. "Be somewhere they don't know the story. Everyone deserves that once." Delia climbed back into her buggy and paused and looked down. "He never wanted you," she said quietly. "You know that. But he never wanted me either. I understand that now. He wanted to have. You were something to have. So was I. So was that ranch and that note and everything else." Her eyes went to the house. "Reed wants you. I don't think he knows how to say it, men like him never do, but I watched him during the fire. He wasn't fighting for the barn. Fool nearly died 3 times trying to keep the flames off the side of the house nearest the room where you sleep." She gathered the reins. "In case you were wondering which of the 2 of them saw you as a person, it was never even close." And she drove away and left Willa standing in the yard with her heart doing something it hadn't done since a boy in Boston she'd been too young to keep. That night, the work done the fire a memory, and Walton in a cell 40 miles off awaiting the circuit judge's docket. Lucas and Willa sat on the porch steps in the dark, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "It's over," Lucas said finally. "The thing that's been coming for weeks. It's just over. Feels strange." "It does. You did it. I want that said plain." He turned to look at her. "I've been fighting Walton in my head my whole life, and losing because you can't fight a man like that with fists or fences. You beat him with a letter and a note and 40 neighbors and a plan you had before I even knew there was a plan. You saved my ranch, Willa. You saved my father's name. You saved—" His voice caught. "You saved a lot more than a barn." "We did it," she corrected. "Equals, like I said the first night. Equals." He was quiet a moment. "Which is why I've got to say a thing and say it right, and it's the hardest thing I ever tried to say, so bear with me." He turned his hat in his hands, the old habit. "When I found you at that depot, I told you I was offering you a name to hide behind. Safety. A locked door between us that I'd never come through. You remember?" "I remember. I meant it. Every word. I brought you out here to help me and to keep you safe, and I told myself that was the whole of it." He drew a breath. "It's not the whole of it anymore. It hasn't been for weeks. And I've kept my mouth shut because I gave you my word about that door, and because you came out here running from a man who wanted to have you, and the last thing on this earth I want is to be one more man who looks at you and sees a thing to keep." He finally looked at her. "But I can't sit here and let you think the arrangement is all it is. Not after tonight. Not after watching you fight that fire. You deserve the truth, even if the truth changes nothing, and the truth is—" He stopped, started again rougher. "The truth is, I don't want it to be pretend anymore, Willa. The wife business. I don't want you to be my wife for the town. I want—" His jaw worked. "I want to earn it for real. That's all. That's the whole of it. I've said it now." Willa's chest was full to aching. And here was the thing she understood in that moment, the thing that made her not answer right away, the thing that made her for the first time take a man's declaration and hold it at arm's length instead of falling into it. She'd crossed a continent once because a man's letters made her feel wanted, and she'd been wrong, and it had nearly destroyed her. She'd learned on a burning depot platform exactly what it cost to be chosen out of a man's need and discarded when the need changed. And she could not say yes to Lucas Reed, the way she'd once said yes to James Walton, gratefully, desperately, because he was offering her a life and she had nowhere else to go. Because that was the trap. Even now, even with a good man, if she said yes tonight, she'd never fully know whether she'd chosen him or chosen the safety, the belonging, the Black Range, and the standing barn, and the town that finally saw her. She'd never know if it was love or just the deepest gratitude a rescued woman ever feels. And she had promised herself, sitting on a trunk in the middle of a hostile street with $4.60 to her name, that the next time a man chose her, she would be a woman who could have said no. "Lucas," she said softly, "look at me." He did. "That's the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me. And I want you to hear that I know it's true, that you're not James Walton, that you have never once looked at me like a thing to have." She took his hand. "But I can't answer you tonight." Something flinched in his face, quickly hidden. "No, listen." She held his hand tighter. "It's not no. Hear me. When I got off that train, I had nothing and no one, and a man offered me a life, and I'd have taken it from anyone who offered because I was drowning. If I say yes to you tonight on this porch, the day you saved my life and I saved your ranch, and we've got no money and a burned range and nowhere for me to go, I'll never know Lucas. I'll never know for the rest of my life whether I chose you or whether I just grabbed the nearest safe hand the way a drowning woman grabs any hand at all." Her voice shook. "And you deserve to be chosen, not grabbed. Chosen by a woman who could have walked away and didn't." Lucas was quiet a long time. "So, what are you telling me?" he said finally low. "I'm telling you I'm going to leave." His head came up. "Not forever. Listen to all of it before your face does that." A small wet laugh. "The circuit judge is going to want witnesses when Walton comes to trial. I'll need to stay in the county seat some weeks for that regardless. But after—" She steadied herself. "I have a little money now. The judge is arranging that the merchants who wronged you make it right, and there's talk of damages against Walton's estate, and some of that's owed to me for the shame he made public. Enough to live on. Enough to stand on my own 2 feet in a town where nobody knows me, and I owe no man anything, and be, for the first time in my whole life, a woman with somewhere to go, and no need of any man to take her there." She pressed his hand to her cheek. "And then, Lucas Reed, when I am a woman who could stay away when I don't need you, when the ranch is nothing to me, and the town is nothing to me, and I could build a whole life anywhere I please, then I'll know. And if what I feel is what I think it is, I'll come back up that ranch road on my own 2 feet and my own free choice, and I'll answer you. And you'll know for certain all the rest of your life that the woman who married you was a woman who chose you, not one who needed you." The tears stood in his eyes and did not fall because he was his father's son. "That could take months," he said. "You could out there on your own, you could decide you don't." "I could," Willa said. "That's the whole point. That's what makes it real." She stood and drew him up with her and stood close in the dark. "You gave me a door that locked from my side, Lucas. The first kind thing anyone gave me out here. Now I'm asking you for the same thing you gave me. A door I can walk out of freely. Because a woman who's never been able to leave can't ever really choose to stay." She reached up and touched his weathered face. "Wait for me. That's all I'm asking. I know it's a hard thing to ask of a man who's already waited 11 lonely years." "I'd wait 11 more," Lucas said, and his voice broke on it. "I'd wait the rest of my life. But Willa—" He caught her hand against his face and held it there. "Come back. Whatever you decide out there in your freedom, decide it fast and come back. Because this house was quiet for a lot of years and I could stand it. And now it won't ever be quiet enough to stand again, not after you. So take your freedom. Earn your certain answer. Be a woman who could walk away." His eyes held hers. "And then, for the love of God, walk back." Willa Dawson stood on the porch of the home she'd rebuilt in the arms of the man who'd lifted her trunk when a whole town wouldn't lift a finger, and she made him no promise, because the whole point was that she couldn't yet, that a promise now would spoil the very thing she was leaving to protect. But she rose up on her toes in the dark, and for the first time she kissed him once, brief and full of everything she wasn't ready to say out loud, and then she stepped back before either of them could pretend it settled anything. "Wait for me," she said again, and in the morning she packed the same trunk she'd arrived with, and Lucas Reed lifted it onto the wagon just as he'd lifted it off that depot platform a lifetime ago, and he drove her to the county seat to begin the strangest thing she'd ever done. The deliberate, terrifying work of becoming a woman who did not need him, so that one day she could return as a woman who simply freely wanted him instead. The county seat was called Prescott, and for the first 3 weeks, Willa hated it. Not the town itself. The town was fine, bigger than Copper Creek, a place where nobody knew her name, and nobody watched her walk down the street doing arithmetic about her past. That was exactly what she'd wanted. That was the problem. She'd spent a month at the Double R learning what it felt like to matter to someone, to be needed in a way that wasn't ownership, to come in from the fire and find a man had nearly killed himself protecting the wall nearest where she slept. And now she'd walked away from it on purpose, into a clean and anonymous freedom, and the freedom was quiet, in exactly the way Lucas had said the house used to be. "You look like a woman who won a fight and can't figure out why she's not happy," said the landlady of the respectable boarding house, where Willa had taken a room with the first of the money. "That's about the size of it," Willa admitted. She threw herself into the work instead. There was plenty of it. The Walton trial was set for the fall docket, and Willa found that the territorial prosecutor, a sharp young man named Hollis, who'd never met a witness so organized in his life, had come to rely on her completely. She'd kept everything. Every date, every name, every merchant who'd been leaned on, laid out in a governess's careful hand. It was Willa who tracked down the freight records showing Walton had bought up the wire. Willa who convinced Bell, the mercantile owner, to testify by showing him plainly that a man who'd already lost the county's respect had better be on the right side when the marshal came asking. Willa who sat with old Cy Perkins in the jail and got him to say calm and complete what Walton had told him the night of the fire. "You'd have made a fine lawyer," Hollis told her once, "if the world were arranged different." "The world's arranged the way it's arranged," Willa said. "But my testimony will hang him just the same, and I find that satisfaction enough." She wrote to Lucas once a week. She'd promised herself she wouldn't, that the whole point was distance was building a self that stood without him. But she found she couldn't help it, and she decided that writing wasn't the same as needing. His letters back were short and awkward, and worth more to her than anything she'd ever owned. He wrote about the range coming back green after a rain, about the calf that was born with a crooked leg that he'd splinted and that lived, about the fence mended at last with real wire, the blacksmith having made good. He never once asked her to come back. She loved him for it, and she understood it because he'd promised her a door that locked from her side, and he wasn't the kind of man to lean on it. The trial came in October. James Walton had money for a good lawyer, and the good lawyer did what good lawyers do. He attacked Mrs. Pruitt's eyesight, her age, her grudges. He suggested Cy Perkins was a paid liar. He painted Lucas Reed as a debtor who'd invented a crime to escape his obligations. For 2 days, it was closer than Willa liked. She sat in the gallery every hour of it, and more than once she caught James Walton looking at her across the courtroom with an expression that had curdled past hate into something almost like wonder, as though even now, even facing the rope, he could not quite believe that the woman he'd handed a letter to on a train platform had brought him to this. On the third day, Willa testified. She did not weep. She did not rage. She told it plain in order the way she'd learned to tell hard things when she buried her parents in the same week and had to arrange it all herself at 19. The contract, the letter of rejection in his own hand, the cornered wire, the impounded cattle, the threat he'd made on Front Street, "I will squeeze that ranch until there's nothing left," which 4 separate witnesses had heard and now confirmed. And when Walton's lawyer rose to suggest she was a scorned woman inventing a persecution, she looked at him levelly and said the thing that ended it. "Sir, I have no reason to invent anything. Mr. Walton rejected me in writing, and I have that writing. I am not a scorned woman. A scorned woman still wants the man. I want nothing from James Walton, but to never think of him again, and I'd have had that gladly if he'd left me and mine in peace. He is not on trial because I was rejected. He is on trial because he cornered the fencing wire in a drought, and then set a fire that could have killed 40 families, mine among them, to win an old grudge against a dead man's son. That is not my grievance, sir. That is the territory's." The jury was out for 40 minutes. They convicted him on the arson. The judge, an old man with a face like a closed ledger, sentenced James Walton to 15 years in the territorial prison at Yuma. Not the rope, because the fire had killed no one, and Lucas Reed himself had risen in that courtroom and asked the judge for mercy on that exact ground, which was a thing that made the whole gallery murmur and made James Walton drop his head into his hands. Because it was the one weapon he had no defense against. He had been shown mercy again, publicly, by the family he'd tried to destroy. And there is no prison worse than that for a man like him. The note was never called. Lucas surrendered it to the court to be destroyed, forgiving the debt entirely, and asked that Walton's ranch forfeit now, with its owner bound for Yuma, be sold, and the money divided among the merchants and families the man had squeezed and frightened for 20 years. The judge, who had never in 30 years seen a man give away a fortune he'd fought to protect, made it so. And then it was over. Truly over. And Willa Dawson was a free woman in Prescott with money in the bank and a reputation as the sharpest witness the territory had seen, and no earthly need of any man alive, which was exactly the position she'd worked so hard to reach. She stayed in Prescott through November. She told herself it was to see Walton's estate settled, and there was truth in that. But the deeper truth, the one she circled around at night, was that she was testing the thing she'd come here to test. She was a woman who could leave now. She could take her money and go to San Francisco, to Denver, back to Boston even, and start clean, and never see the Double R or Lucas Reed again. The door was open. She'd built it open with her own hands. The question was whether she'd walk through it. She had offers to stay. Hollis, the prosecutor, made it delicately clear that a woman of her abilities, and he did not quite say her person, would find Prescott a very comfortable place to settle. He was a good man, young, with prospects. It would have been the sensible choice, the safe choice, the choice a woman makes when she's learned that need is a trap and love is a risk. Willa turned him down kindly and understood in the turning down that she had her answer. Because when she imagined a comfortable life in Prescott with a good, safe man of prospects, she felt nothing but a mild gray peace. And when she imagined a ranch road and a green range come back from fire, and a weathered man who turned his hat in his hands and gave her a door that locked from her side, she felt her whole heart lean north like a plant toward a window. That was how she knew. Not because she needed the Double R. She didn't need it anymore, not one bit. That was the whole point. That was the freedom she'd bought with 3 hard months. But because being free to go anywhere on earth, the only place she wanted to be, was the one place she'd once had nowhere else to go. The need had burned away in the fire. What was left underneath it, clean and certain, was choice. She wrote Lucas one last letter, but she didn't mail it. She carried it in her pocket instead, and she bought a stage ticket to Copper Creek, and on a cold, clear morning in the first week of December, she loaded the same trunk she'd carried from Boston lighter, now though it held more, and she started home. She didn't send word she was coming. She wanted to see his face when he didn't expect it. The stage put her down at the same depot where a whole town had once watched her shame. It was quieter now. The station master Ferris was still there, older, and when he saw her, his mouth fell open. "Miss Dawson," he said. We heard you'd gone for good. To the city. I went, Willa agreed. And now I've come back. She looked around the platform where she'd sat on a trunk with $4.60 and no home in all the world. It didn't frighten her now. It was just a train platform, and she was just a woman who'd chosen where to stand on it. I'll need a wagon or a horse out to the Double R, Mr. Ferris. I can pay for it. I can pay for a good deal of things now. But she didn't need to hire one. Because Copper Creek was a small town, and the stage road ran past the Mercantile, and by the time Willa had walked halfway down Front Street, the word had already run ahead of her, the Boston woman's back, the one who took down Walton, and people came out onto the boardwalk to see, and this time, they did not whisper behind their hands. This time, the blacksmith's wife pressed a wrapped loaf into her arms, and Belle, the Mercantile owner, came out and said gruff and awkward that her account was good at his store for life. And old Mrs. Pruitt appeared from her blue door and looked Willa up and down and said, "Well, took you long enough," and then hugged her fierce and fast and let go before either of them could cry. "Is he in town?" Willa asked her. "Reed number Founders Day dance is tonight. Everybody's out at the Grange. He'll be there. Man goes every year, stands in the corner, dances with nobody, leaves early." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes were shrewd. "Been doing it 11 years. You planning to change that?" "I'm planning to try. Then borrow my buckboard and quit standing in the street. You've done enough standing in this street to last 3 lifetimes." And she thrust the reins at Willa and shooed her off, and Willa laughed and drove out toward the Grange Hall in the last of the light, with her heart going like a hammer. The dance was in full swing when she got there. The whole county turned out fiddle music spilling out into the cold, and Willa stood a moment at the edge of it gathering her courage. Then she went in. She found him exactly where Mrs. Pruitt had said in the corner, apart a cup of something in his hand. He wasn't drinking. Watching the dancers with the patient endurance of a man doing a duty. He'd cleaned up. His good shirt, his hair combed. A man who came to the dance every year and danced with no one, because the only woman he'd ever wanted to dance with had gone to Prescott to become free of him. He hadn't seen her yet. And Willa Dawson, who had planned 100 careful speeches on the stage ride home, found that every one of them left her the moment she looked at his face. So she did the only thing that felt true. She crossed the whole crowded floor, straight through the dancers, in front of the entire county, and she stopped in front of Lucas Reed, and she watched the cup go still in his hand, and his whole face changed disbelief, and then a hope so raw it hurt to see. "Willa," he breathed. When did you— I didn't get a letter. I didn't know. I didn't send one." Her voice shook only a little. "I wanted to tell you in person." She was aware of the music faltering, of heads turning, of the whole room, beginning to understand it was watching something. She didn't care. She'd been watched by this town at her lowest, and she'd be watched by it at her highest, and this time she'd chosen the stage herself. "You asked me a question on your porch 3 months ago. You asked me to be your wife for real, not for the town. And I told you I couldn't answer because I needed to become a woman who could walk away first. Do you remember?" Every word. He'd set the cup down. His hands were shaking. "Willa, if the answer's no, you don't have to cross a whole dance floor to— Lucas Reed." She stepped closer and the room went quiet around them, fiddle and all. "Listen to me, because I only want to say this once, and I want the whole county to hear it, since the whole county heard the worst day of my life, and by God they can hear the best one too." She took a breath. "I have money now. My own. I have a reputation and offers and a whole open world, and there is a good man in Prescott who asked me to stay and build a comfortable life, and I could have said yes. I could go anywhere on this earth tonight. I need nothing from you. Not a roof, not a name, not a locked door. Nothing." Her eyes filled, and she let them because she wasn't ashamed of it. "And that is exactly why I can finally answer you. Because when I close my eyes and imagine every place I could go free and safe and beholden to no one, the only place I want to be is a ranch road 8 miles north of a town that once threw me away. Not because I have to be there, because I choose it. I choose the range, and the quiet, and the crooked-legged calf, and the dishwater on the garden." Her voice broke clean open. "I choose you, Lucas. Not to survive. I survived just fine without you. I choose you because a life anywhere else without you in it is just a comfortable way of being somewhere I don't want to be." For a moment, Lucas Reed could not speak at all. Then he said hoarse, "You're sure? You're certain? Because I told you I'd wait the rest of my life, and I meant it. And I won't have you say this out of need." She laughed through the tears. "Lucas, I just turned down a prosecutor and a house in town to drive a borrowed buckboard to a barn dance and propose to a broke rancher in front of 200 people. Does that look like need to you need is quiet and desperate? This," she spread her hands, taking in the room, the crowd, the whole outrageous public spectacle of it. "This is a woman who could have anything, standing up in front of everyone, choosing the one thing she wants. There's no need left in me anywhere. It all burned up in your South Range. This is just want. Pure, free, chosen want." She held out her hand. "Now, Lucas Reed, I don't want to be a housekeeper. I don't want a name to hide behind. I want to be your wife for real and for good, and for no reason on this earth except that I looked at the whole wide world and picked you out of it. Will you dance with me? And then in the spring, will you marry me?" The Grange Hall held its breath, and Lucas Reed, who had lifted her trunk when a whole town wouldn't lift a finger, who had given a stranger a door that locked from her side, who had fought a fire to save the wall nearest where she slept and asked a judge for mercy on the man who'd lit it. Lucas Reed took her hand, and the tears he'd held back like his father's son finally spilled over, and he said the only word that mattered. "Yes," he said. "God, yes. To all of it. Forever." And he pulled her into his arms, and the fiddle player struck up again, and the whole county erupted, cheering, stamping old Mrs. Pruitt loudest of all, and Lucas Reed danced with a woman for the first time in 11 years, in the middle of a crowded floor, holding her like a man who'd finally been handed the one thing he'd never let himself hope for. They were married in the spring, in the small church in Copper Creek, and the whole town came, the same town that had watched her shame packed now into the pews, to watch her joy. Because towns are like that, small and frightened and capable of cruelty, but capable too of learning, of standing in a firelight, and choosing better, of pressing a loaf of bread into the arms of a woman they'd once turned away. Mrs. Pruitt sat in the front row in a new hat and cried the whole way through and denied it after. The blacksmith gave the bride away, having asked for the honor himself gruffly, because Willa had no father living. And he said a woman like her ought to be given away by somebody who'd stood in the fire beside her. The double R changed after that, the way a house changes when it stops holding its breath. Willa filled it with clean linens and books read aloud in the evenings, and in time with more. Their daughter was born the following winter in the room that had once been Lucas's mother's, and they named her Grace for the mercy that ran in her father's family like water in a good year. Lucas would stand in the doorway of that room some nights and watch his wife with their child, and remember the woman he'd found sitting on a trunk in the road with nowhere on earth to go, and marvel that she'd chosen to come back to him when the whole world had finally opened its doors. But Willa knew a truth Lucas was too humble to see. She hadn't come back because he'd saved her. Anyone could save a drowning woman. James Walton had once offered to in his way, and it had meant nothing. Lucas had done the rarer thing. He had handed her a door that locked from her side, and then he had waited, had let her go all the way to Prescott and freedom, and other men's offers had never once tugged the door shut behind her, because he understood alone among all the men she'd ever known that love, you can't leave, isn't love at all. It's just a nicer cage. He had set her free. And a woman who has been set free and comes back anyway, comes back all the way. Years later, when Grace was old enough to ask how her mother and father met Willa, would sit her down and tell her the truth, all of it, the way she'd learned to tell hard things plain. She'd tell her about the letter on the burning platform, and the $4.60, and the town that laughed. And Grace would ask every time the same question children always ask, "But weren't you so sad, Mama, being left like that?" And Willa Dawson Reed would pull her daughter close and give her the only answer that had ever been true. For one afternoon, she'd say, "I thought being left at that depot was the end of my whole story. I thought I was a thing that got thrown away." She'd smooth her daughter's hair and look out toward the range where a man she'd chosen freely was riding home in the evening light. But being left behind wasn't the end of my story, Grace. It was the beginning of the real one. Because the man who was supposed to want me threw me away like I was nothing, and the man who was never supposed to want me at all took one look at a stranger with a trunk and saw everything the other one missed. And that was the whole truth of it. And Willa never told it any other way, because it was the one thing in all her hard-won life that had turned out exactly perfectly right. The woman they left at the depot built the finest life in the county. And she built it by choosing freely, and with her whole heart, the one man wise enough to let her go first.